Hello. In this next lecture, I want to briefly discuss the most common targets of terrorism. As in the previous section, what I want to do here is think about some of our stereotypes about targets and then compare those stereotypes to what we find when we look at over 113,000 terrorist attacks that are recorded in the Global Terrorism Database from 1970 to the present. If you think about media portrayals, I think when we think of terrorism, we often think of it as an attack on an innocent civilian. It's almost the hallmark of terrorism to think about injuring or killing innocent civilians. And indeed, when we look at these cases in more detail, we find that this does happen a lot of times. But often the targeting is also a lot more complicated than you might think when you actually get down and look at individual cases. If you look at the first table, I demonstrate some of this complexity by analyzing the types of targets attacked in the events included in the GTD. The GTD actually records up to 3 different targets for each attack. And I think the overarching thing I want to get across to you, and this is going to be true for I think all of the lectures that we give based on the GTD, is that when you look at the reality of how terrorism has actually happened over the past 4 or 5 decades, the reality ends up being a lot more complex than our sort of stereotypes. And so what I want to do in this lecture is communicate some of that complexity. Now, consistent with most common stereotypes about terrorism, the table shows that private citizens and their property were indeed the single largest category of targets in the GTD. They accounted for more than 27,000 attacks in the database. This amounts to about a quarter of the whole database. But at the same time, the table shows a lot of variation and a lot of complexity in terms of the targeting of private citizens. For example, while not referring directly to attacks on private citizens, several of the other target categories in the table probably involve private citizens. So this would include attacks against businesses, which could include private citizens, attacks against cars, against trains, against other types of land-based transportation, against utilities, against schools, against educational systems. Practically all of the categories we have in this target list could involve some citizen attack as well. Even in attacks that seem to be aimed mostly at the government, the military, the police, civilians are frequently killed or injured. This was the case, for example, in a couple of high-profile cases that happened in Bali, Indonesia in the early 2000s. In these cases, a group called Jemaah Islamiyah, JI, staged 2 attacks where assailants took the lives of 200 people, but some of the individuals attacked were in the military, some of them were government officials, and some of them were private citizens. So in other words, the attacks struck private citizens, but also struck a lot of other individuals as well. In terms of transportation tactics and targets, the GTD includes 3 types that are directly related to transportation. These include land transportation, airports and aircraft, and maritime. And I think among the attacks on civilians, public transportation, infrastructure, and vehicles are among the scariest, partly because I think when public transportation is targeted, it makes everybody feel vulnerable since so many people depend on public transportation. Also, public transportation tends to, particularly when there's bombings involved, the transportation device itself tends to amplify the impact of the explosion, so it tends to be deadlier in these sorts of circumstances. Some of the most well-known terrorist attacks in modern history have targeted transportation systems. For example, in 1995, Aum Shinrikyo released sarin gas in the Tokyo subway system during rush hour. It killed 13 people but made thousands of others ill. A less publicized but even deadlier railway attack occurred in Angola in August 2001 on the railway route that served as a critical connection between the capital of Luanda and the city of Dondo. The train was filled with commuters coming home from the capital for the weekend when it hit and detonated an anti-truck mine and ignited the train's fuel tank. As people fled the train, members of the National Union for the Total Independence of Angola, UNITA, fired upon them with automatic weapons. More than half of the train's 500 passengers were killed and most of the remaining passengers were injured. And to make things worse, the remote location of the attack made it very difficult for authorities to respond. If you look at transportation attacks, the one that's probably the most iconic are attacks on airplanes, and maybe the one that draws the greatest fear from the public as well. Several of the earliest and most dramatic terrorist attacks on planes took place in September 1970. In fact, this date became known as Black September after the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, the PFLP, staged coordinated hijackings of 4 flights in one day. All 4 of these flights shared the same destination, New York City, and departed from airports in Western Europe. 1 came from Germany, 1 came from Switzerland, and 2 came from the Netherlands. And this was, of course, extremely well publicized, was in all of the international media, and caused a huge amount of international concern. While many of the most notorious hijacking events have targeted airplanes, terrorist groups have carried out maritime hijackings that have been extremely deadly as well. Many of the more recent maritime hijackings recorded in the GTD involve cargo ships or oil tankers targeted by organizations, diverse organizations actually, including the Liberation Tigers of Tamil Eelam, LTTE, and the Movement for the Emancipation of the Niger Delta. So anyway, what we can see about these attacks on transportation is they often are well publicized and contain or involve quite a bit of public concern. What about government targets? As shown in the table, after private citizens and businesses, the next most common target of terrorist attacks are government entities. This makes up nearly 14% of all the attacks in the GTD. To give you an example of a highly publicized government attack, think back to April 1995 when the Alfred P. Murrah Federal Building in Oklahoma City was bombed, and at that time 550 people and their children worked and were at the building's daycare center. On the morning of the attack, Timothy McVeigh parked a rental truck filled with explosives near the building. The resulting explosion killed 168 people, including 19 children, destroyed the building, and left a 20-foot wide, 8-foot deep crater in the street. Although the attack was clearly aimed at a government building, it highlights what I was saying just a moment ago. A lot of the victims, most of the victims, were ordinary civilians, as well as children. We also distinguish in the data diplomatic targets, and you'll see the GTD classifies diplomatic targets as distinct from general government targets. Just under 3% of all attacks between 1970 and 2012 targeted diplomatic facilities and personnel. And this includes, for example, attacks on United Nations agencies and staff. To give you just one example, in August 1998, al-Qaeda members carried out coordinated truck bombings at the U.S. embassies in Dar es Salaam, Tanzania, and in Nairobi, Kenya, killing more than 200 people and injuring thousands more. These attacks were remarkable both because al-Qaeda was able to detonate trucks loaded with explosives close to these heavily guarded embassies, but also because the assailants were able to coordinate nearly simultaneous attacks in destinations that were over 400 miles apart. The GTD actually classifies the embassies targeted in these 2 attacks as diplomatic, but in fact, if you look at the casualties, the overwhelming number of them were civilians. In contrast to these large-scale, indiscriminate bombings, other attacks on diplomatic facilities and personnel have been much more targeted. For example, there were numerous attacks on diplomats in Libya in 2012. In June of that year, an explosive device was thrown at the consulate in Benghazi, but only damaged the front gate. This was a group calling itself the Brigades of the Imprisoned Sheikh Omar Abdel Rahman. 2 assaults on the U.S. consulate and the CIA annex in September killed 4 Americans, and including, of course, Ambassador Christopher Stevens. These attacks sparked several congressional and administrative investigations about security of the facilities and the Obama administration's handling of the attacks. And then on August 6, 2013, CNN reported that the United States Department of Justice filed criminal charges against several individuals, including the militia leader Ahmed Abu Khattala, for alleged involvement in the attacks. Now, oftentimes when we think about terrorism, we don't think of how it can be directed at police targets. But as you can see in the figure, this is a relatively common outcome. And in fact, police are present throughout communities. They're often not protected. They're often not in well-secured locations. They're not often under heavy protection. And they also offer terrorists the opportunity for both a symbolic and a tactical strike. And we find that attacks on police in the database are fairly common. More than 13% of all attacks from 1970 to 2012 are on police. An unusually deadly police-related attack occurred on June 11, 1990, during a period of particularly intense fighting between the LTTE and the Sri Lankan government. The LTTE seized approximately 20 police stations in a coordinated attack in eastern Sri Lanka and abducted hundreds of police officers. Reports on the total number of casualties on this day vary greatly but consistently indicate more than 100 police officers were killed after they surrendered. Among the most active perpetrator groups in the GTD, several have been particularly inclined to attack police targets. This includes the Irish Republican Army, the Taliban, the Basque Fatherland and Freedom, or the ETA, the Communist Party of India Maoist, the African National Congress, and Boko Haram. Each of these groups are especially likely to target police, or have been in the past. Another group that we don't think of frequently when we talk about terrorism are military targets. As you know from most definitions of terrorism, emphasize attacks on civilians, but it's often very difficult to separate attacks on military targets from civilian attacks. Take the April 1986 bombing of La Belle discotheque in Berlin. It's a good example of where military targets are attacked alongside civilians. A bomb, in this case, exploded inside a location that was frequented by U.S. soldiers, killing 3 people but wounding more than 200. 2 of the 3 people killed and scores of those injured were servicemen. However, the remaining casualties were civilians. Another high-profile case that involved a military target is the October 2000 attack on the USS Cole. Members of Al-Qaeda pulled a rubber raft full of explosives up to the side of the 505-foot Navy-guided missile destroyer as it refueled in the port of Yemen. The explosion tore a 40-square-foot hole in the side of the vessel, killed 17 crew members, and wounded 39 others. Most commonly, attacks on military targets around the world are aimed at recruiting centers, and these often involve, of course, civilian casualties. In fact, highly lethal terrorist attacks on both military and police recruiting centers have been fairly common in Afghanistan, Algeria, Iraq, and Pakistan. Now, after all of these targets that are pretty common, we have a sort of grab bag of others that are much less common, but nonetheless very important. These include attacks against religious figures, attacks against journalists, attacks against non-state militias, attacks against other terrorist organizations and violent political parties, attacks on non-governmental organizations. And just to give you a few examples of this diversity, a series of highly destructive attacks on religious institutions occurred on Christmas Eve 2000 in Indonesia, when nearly 40 bombs were planted at Christian churches in 13 cities across the country. According to the GTD, Jemaah Islamiyah was suspected to be responsible for these attacks. Attacks against journalists or media representatives also encompass attacks on newspaper offices, television, and radio stations, those who work in journalism, such as reporters. In one such high-profile attack in 1974, a left-wing group called the Symbionese Liberation Army targeted American media magnate Randolph Apperson Hearst by kidnapping his daughter, Patricia Hearst. Historically, many attacks on journalists and media targets have involved hostage barricade incidents, where perpetrators forcefully seize control of a radio station in order to broadcast their message. This tactic was especially common in Latin America during the 1970s and 1980s, where more than half of all attacks on journalists and the media targeted radio personnel or facilities, and more than half of these were barricade hostage events that rarely resulted in casualties. Since 2000, attacks on journalists and the media have been most common in Iraq, Pakistan, and Afghanistan, but with large numbers of events also occurring in Somalia and the Philippines. Less than 2% of attacks between 1970 and 2012 involved attacks that targeted other terrorist organizations. This most often happens when there's competition between multiple organizations operating in the same general area of each other. For example, there have been attacks by the Irish Republican Army that targeted the Ulster Freedom Fighters in Northern Ireland. There were attacks by the Liberation Tigers of Tamil Eelam, the LTT, against other Tamil groups or various breakaway groups from the LTT in Sri Lanka and so on. We also see that there are a few cases that target non-governmental organizations, NGOs. The NGOs targeted are extremely diverse. They range from small non-profit agencies like African American Community Centers in New York City to large international organizations such as the Red Cross, but a great amount of diversity as well. As we discussed above, the four most common terrorist targets in the GTD are first private citizens, second businesses, third government, and fourth the police. In the last part of this lecture, I'd like to talk very briefly about how these different targets look if you look at the data over the regions of the world. And then also I want to look at trends in these targets over time before concluding this section. If we look at the regions of the world, private citizens and property are the most frequent targets in 6 of the 13 regions of the world that we've identified here. Businesses are the most common primary target in North America, South America, and in Western Europe. When we consider the perpetrators of attacks on businesses in these regions, we note that in North America, businesses were frequently attacked by environmental and animal rights groups, such as the Earth Liberation Front and the Animal Liberation Front, which makes good sense because the grievances of these organizations are often directed at the businesses that they perceive to be harming either the environment or animals, such as the lumber industry, fast food industry, or the fur industry. Extreme environmental groups such as ELF have also attacked businesses in Western Europe. However, local separatist groups such as the ETA, the Corsican National Liberation Front, and the IRA were responsible for most of the attacks on businesses in Western Europe, especially in the 1970s and 1980s. The most common business target for ETA and the FLNC were banks, while the IRA was most likely to attack shops, bars, and restaurants. The FARC and the National Liberation Army of Colombia are among the most prominent groups that targeted businesses in South America. These two groups have attacked a wide variety of businesses, including banks, construction sites, ranches, retail stores, even trucking companies. Turning back to the figure, we see that the government is the most common target in East Asia, Central Asia, and in Australasia, Oceania, all of which are regions with relatively few terrorist attacks in general in the GTD. Finally, the police are the most commonly targeted group in Russia and the newly independent states. The terrorists that most openly target the police in this region are Chechen rebel groups. Given their grievances with the Russian government, it's perhaps unsurprising that these groups target police and other government officials in terms of their attack patterns. At the same time, Chechen separatists have been involved in several major attacks that have targeted civilians, including very bloody attacks on theaters and schools. Finally, how do these targets look if you look at them over time, over the 43 years included in the data? We give you an illustration of this for the four most common targets in the next figure. Interestingly, while the top 4 targets trend closely to one another for much of the series, the most common of these 4 attack targets changes over time. So for most of the 1970s, businesses were the most frequently targeted of the 4 categories. Businesses also were the leading target in a few years, 85, 86, and 91, around the time of the collapse of the Soviet Union. By contrast, government is only the most common target for terrorists in 2 years of the series, in 1970 and 1988. Police are never the most common target, although the frequency of attacks on police have gone up dramatically in the last 12 or 13 years, surpassing both government and business targets. In 72 and 73 and throughout much of the 80s, 90s, and 2000s, private citizens and property were the most common of the 4 types of targets. In fact, near the end of the series in 2008 and 2009, private citizens and their property were targeted in nearly 50% of terrorist attacks on these 4 types of targets. For the last few years of the series, nearly 1/3 of the attacks on private citizens and their property took place in a single country, the country of Iraq. A few conclusions about targets of terrorism. I began this section by exploring in greater detail the idea that terrorists primarily attack private citizens. We can see that there's a good deal of truth to this assertion, but that it's complicated, that it's often difficult to separate attacks on private citizens from attacks on government, attacks on police, attacks on the military, or even attacks on different types of transportation. So in other words, it's hard to know exactly if the terrorists were out to get civilians or they happened to kill civilians in their efforts to hit some other kind of target. And a lot of times we just do not have enough detail and we don't know enough about the motivations of the terrorists to actually determine which of these is the case. Also, many attacks impact multiple types of targets, and in these cases it's very difficult to know. If we look at the Bali bombings, for example, there were lots of soldiers killed, but there were also lots of ordinary citizens killed as well. When we examine targets across regions, we see that private citizens and property are the most common of the four types in 6 of the 13 world regions, but we also see a fair amount of variability across the world. Furthermore, this tendency to target private citizens and property has become more prevalent since the early 1990s. Prior to that period, terrorist groups attacked other types of targets about as often as private citizens. In short, we find that private citizens are often the target of terrorist attacks, and during many periods they are in fact the most common targets of terrorist attacks. Nevertheless, the GTD also reveals a good deal of variation and a lot of complexity in targeting strategies. In the next lecture, I want to conclude this 3-part series by talking about tactics used by the terrorist organizations in the GTD since 1970. Thank you very much.